All right, good morning. We have made it to our last lecture. All you really have left is your final exam. As I said, I think I've started glancing at the grades and stuff, and it seems we are about where I thought, that people have either improved or they've held steady and stuff. All right, couple things. I'm gonna get through a nervous system lecture. Nowhere near what I'd like to get through, but we'll do the best we can. At least it'll be an overview of the organization of the nervous system, and like we sort of always do, basically being able to classify some of the cells that make up the nervous system. So the different support cells versus what it means to be a nerve or a neuron. So we'll do classifications of that. So I don't think it should be too bad. We'll get rolling there in just a second. A couple other things. Today is the last lecture. Tomorrow's dead day and all that kind of stuff. We do not have another quiz that's set. There is visible body that you can work through. The practice quizzes are up on that. I encourage you to go through that. I will use some of those questions for your final exam. But if I looked at the schedule right, your final exam's a week from today. I think yours is scheduled for Tuesday. And I will basically make the exam available that morning. I should have it up by 8 a.m. and it'll be available for the day. So kind of set up just like your Blackboard quizzes. You'll have all day. It just needs to be completed before midnight. A little bit different though. It is like the last exam. So there's 50 questions. It will cover all the muscle and nervous system stuff that I have gone through. A mix of true, false, multiple choice. So again, just like the Blackboard quizzes you had, just like the last exam or that first exam we took online. And you'll have 1 hour. So there'll be a time limit of an hour. And once that's over, then yeah, I guess we get to start our summer, or what summer looks like. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and get started on the lecture. If there are questions, jump in. I'll try to open that chat box so I can see those, but we're going to wander through some nervous system stuff. All right, a couple of things. What we're going to do here is I want to wander through. I'll post this outline like I do the other outlines you have that go along. So this outline goes along with the Zoom lecture. Again, if you're keying in just on that. But what we're going to do is wander through the nervous system stuff. Now, when we think about regulating systems of the body, there's two major regulating systems of the body. And one of those is the nervous system. I get you for the nervous system. If we were in the classroom, we'd get a lot more of that. But essentially, there are two major regulation systems of the body. There is the endocrine system. You go on and do endocrine system in ANP2. I don't get you for that. And then there's the nervous system. But the reason I introduced those two is understanding these two regulating systems are slightly different. When we introduce the endocrine system, your endocrine system is thought of as a slow-acting system, a slow communication regulation system of the bodies. It works with the use of hormones. And when we use that word hormone, we just mean it's a chemical messenger, and that chemical messenger has to travel in the blood. So you basically put a chemical in the blood, that that chemical then has to travel through your body to what ends up being the target organ. There's a lot of time when you talk about hormones like your testosterone or estrogen, or when we were doing the skeletal system, I said growth hormone. These are all things that get released into the bloodstream, and so they have to travel to the organ which they'll work on. That's why we consider it a slow acting, because that takes time to make that chemical, to have it released into the blood, and then it has to travel in the blood. So when we say slow, a lot of times we mean days, sometimes hours, maybe even minutes, but a lot of times these things take time to work. And if that's the case, then if they take time to work, then you're looking at they take a little time to turn on. They also take some time to turn off. Now, you'll do a good bit more of that when y'all start ANP2. What we get to focus on is the other regulating system, and that's your nervous system. It is fast. And when we say fast, for the most part, we're talking this thing works within milliseconds. And you saw some of that, at least a highlight of that, when we looked at a skeletal neuromuscular junction, that point where a neuron meets a skeletal muscle. We just went through that sequence of events. And remember, that took some time, but I still said it was relatively fast. Well, if we just look at the nerve side of that, or what travels down that axon, that's really, really fast. And so if you pick up or just think for a second, when I was looking at that traveling down the axon to the axon terminal, meeting that neuromuscular junction, when we introduced that action potential on that axon and we talk about speed, we're talking about somewhere along the lines when it travels down a neuron of roughly 150 meters per second. So again, even though that takes time when we were doing that skeletal muscle contraction, it's really, really fast, all right, at least on that nerve side of things. So your nervous system, for the most part, is a regulating system, but it's designed to work really quickly. This is why we have our reflexes, if you will. They're protective in a lot of situations. All right. We can take then the nervous system and divide it into three broad functional categories. And these functional categories revolve around how we take information and integrate that information. All right, I'm going to pause this for a second to try to get you to see or picture what it is I'm talking about here. When we talk about integrating information, or talk about processing information, all right, that involves these stimuli. So you have some sensory input, and then you decide on a motor response. Now, whether you voluntarily decide or involuntarily decide, it doesn't matter, all right? My point is I can voluntarily decide to flex my arm, but that still involved a relay of events. I still processed it in my brain, all right? That's different though. We talk about my heart, all right? My heart's gonna beat, hopefully it does, no matter what I do thinking about it or not. So it's an involuntary response, but something has to tell my heart, hey, heart, speed up. Hey, heart, slow down. Or I ever think about you step outside. Right now it's nice and warm. You begin to sweat, all right? Why did your body know to sweat? And so this revolves around being able to integrate information, all right? So I'm gonna try to wander through what I mean by that in a sort of a different note here. I have some scissors. These scissors are sharp. Now, I can, don't do this at home. I can try this, if you will, and put my finger in these scissors. Now, I already know this is sharp. I feel the scissors. So let's just talk about that. I feel the scissors in my finger. That means some stimulus, some sensory information, a sensation I'm feeling has just traveled on a neuron back to my brain. My brain is sitting there going, please don't squeeze. Please don't make that painful. All right. Now, because I'm sitting here voluntarily doing this, it's like, oh, I should probably move my finger out of there. All right. Let's take a different arm. If I touch the end of these scissors, do I feel it? Yes. Is it painful? Not yet. But if I continue to push, something might tell me to reach my arm back. Think about it the same way. If you reach out and you touch a stove, now that stove may not be on, so you don't really have to have any response. But if it's on, I bet your hand jerks back. You have a reflex. That is because you have some stimulus, a sensory input that has traveled back to your brain, and your brain has decided on that motor response. Pull your arm away. That's what we mean by integrating information. All right. So if we divide your nervous system into these three broad functional categories, then much of that revolves around integrating that information. The integration involves the use of your brain and spinal cord. All right? How you integrate that information is based on the sensory information coming back to it. This is some stimulus out in, This is some stimulus out in the body. Now, if we had time, man, we could spend a ton talking about exteroceptors and interoceptors and propria. We could talk about all this sensory information, and that would have been the goal had we been in the classroom. But in our regard, I just want to focus on one tiny, small little class of sensory information. I think I actually introduced it very early in the class when we were still back in the classroom. All right, I want you to think about things we taught when we say sensations. Things like touch, all right? I stuck my finger out and I touched the end of those scissors and I could feel that I was touching something. We have temperature. I know, I can tell warm, hot, cold. So when I reach out and I touch a surface, I can feel the temp. I know I'm touching it, and I can feel the temperature of that surface. There is pressure. All right. I know if I'm putting a lot of pressure, if I'm pushing hard on the end of the scissor, or if I'm pushing lightly on the. So think about someone reaching out and grabbing hold of your arm. Do they grab it gently, like they want to hold your hand, or are they squeezing your arm to drag you with them? That's, you both have the touch sensation and a pressure associated with that. Think about it like you talk about, it's all nice, a massage. Think about a deep tissue massage. So think about the pressure associated with that. All right. And last but not least, we have pain. All right. I can reach out and touch those scissors, but there's a point that it changes between I know I'm touching it and, hey, that's painful. All right. Or let's think that temperature changes, that it's like, ooh, it's cold. Now it's warm. Now it's hot. Then it's painful. These all involve different receptors that fire or respond, different triggers, if you will. All right. That's what we mean by sensory information. Well, that sensory information is because of all the nerves and neurons out in your body. So if we think about that, that has to be integrated at the level of the brain and spinal cord. So if we sort of draw, and this is going to be really rudimentary, but imagine now that I have your brain, and you know your brain leads to your spinal cord, and a lot of the information we send to the brain has to essentially relay through the spinal cord. A lot of times information on a neuron travels back to the spinal cord, and then it goes up to the brain. But let's look at what we say, what's going on here. All right. So coming out from the periphery, imagine, if you will, I have my hand. And we know my hand has neurons in it and wires, and it leads back to my body. And obviously your arms connect to your torso. So the nerves connect there, and they're going to run to the spinal cord. My point here is, if we look at that and you have that you've touched some surface, then there is a sensory information associated with touch, temperature, pressure, and pain. And when that stimulus is triggered, I've touched that surface, that sensory information travels back to the spinal cord. That sensory information relays up to my brain. So now I've touched that surface, and my brain is able to integrate that. So a sensory sensation comes back to the spinal cord and up to the brain. And my brain is the integrator. My brain gets to process that information. And when it processes that information, you are then able to, your brain decides on a motor response. That's going to be an effect. All right. Your effector involves either a muscle, and this can be a muscle you control, like skeletal muscle, or muscles you don't. You're smooth, you're cardiac, and it can be a gland. But my point is, based off how that information, that sensory impulse is integrated and processed up here, you then have and decide on the motor response. Do you yank your hand back? Can you leave it there? Do you like that pressure? Do you dislike that pressure? All right. You then are able to, or your brain has integrated what that muscle response or what that effect has to be. Take that the effect stimulates a gland. You go outside and you feel your body temperature go up. So when your skin receptors for temperature begin to increase, that increase in body temperature, that sensation, sensory information travels back to the brain, and your brain says, man, I'm overheating here. What should I do? Well, let's turn on or have a motor response that turns on my sweat glands. And so when we talk about the broad functions, it all involves around sensory information coming back to the spinal cord and brain so that you can integrate some type of motor response. All right, that's the general job of your nervous system. Now, we can take the nervous system and divide it into two main parts. Your nervous system as a whole is divided into what we call the central nervous system, we'll abbreviate from now on your CNS. And there's the peripheral nervous system. That is your PNS. So your two divisions of your nervous system are the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. For all intents and purposes, your central nervous system is your brain, your spinal cord, and this is very specific here. It is nervous tissue restricted to the central nervous system. All right, that'll make sense here in just a second. Your peripheral nervous system is all nerve tissue outside the central nervous system. So it is all your nervous tissue that lies outside the central nervous system. Now, here's why it gets a little tricky. It even includes, in addition to that, it even includes your 12 cranial nerves. Remember, you're learning about those in lab. Olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, blah, 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 blah. All those. Now, I hope you recognize that a cranial nerve probably attaches to your brain. You're learning those on that brain structure, right? Olfactory, optic. Okay, that still, technically speaking, is part of the peripheral nervous system. Here is why that is, and I'm going to try to draw this again. Your brain and your spinal cord. And if we divide this in to a region here, when we define the central nervous system, your central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord and any nerve tissue that is only here between these yellow lines. Now, your peripheral nervous system is all of the nerve tissue that is outside here. So your peripheral nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Even if that nerve, like one of your cranial nerves, attaches here, a good portion of that nerve comes out into the periphery. So even though it's attaching to the brain, it is considered part of the peripheral nervous system. That is true, and was in addition to your 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So a spinal nerve attaches to the spine, but most of that nerve comes out and say to the end of my finger, to the end of my toes, and all of those things. So those, even though they do attach obviously to the brain and spinal cord, they are considered part of your peripheral nervous system. Okay. Your peripheral nervous system has two functional divisions. So now what we're going to do, and I'm going to wrap this up in a picture. Let me get through this, and then we'll take a look at a diagram that wanders through this overview. But your peripheral nervous system has two functional divisions, all right? In other words, what's its function? What do these parts of the peripheral nervous system do? And those functional divisions are the sensory or afferent division and the motor or efferent division. All right? Now, I've already introduced these terms. See? So you already have an idea of what we're talking about here, and I've actually already diagrammed what that looks like. Take, for example, that you see my green line here when we talked about sensory information, and look at the direction of travel. When we talked about the motor division, look, I draw those arrows too in the direction of travel. So when we talk about a functional division, the functional divisions for the peripheral nervous system is based on the direction of travel either towards your CNS or away from your CNS, towards the central nervous system or away from the central nervous system. Sensory information is always traveling towards your brain and spinal cord. All right. It is also referred to as the afferent division. So these two words are referring to the same thing. Sensory or afferent information travels towards your central nervous system. All right. The motor or efferent division, now these two words are meaning the same thing. All right. Your motor or efferent division goes away from the central nervous system. All right, traveling away from. And again, if you look at that picture above when I diagrammed it, you can see the arrows in the direction they're traveling. That's very specific. All right, so we can also now subdivide the motor or efferent division. All right, now if we start thinking about this a little bit, what do you mean by divide the motor response? Well, I hope in a second this is a little bit obvious. Your motor response. When we look at the motor response, is your motor response something that you voluntarily control, like a skeletal muscle? Or is it something that's involuntary, like a cardiac muscle, like your heart? All right, like digestion. All right, things like that. So your motor or efferent division also then gets to get further subdivided. And it is divided into two main parts. Your motor division is the somatic nervous system. So we can call that the SNS if we need to abbreviate. And you have the autonomic nervous system. All right. So our motor response, if it's part of the somatic nervous system, is our voluntary response. All right. It is always associated with skeletal muscle. You've already seen this because you looked at a motor unit and where it meets a neuromuscular junction. That is where a motor neuron, that nerve ends with an axon terminal reaching a skeletal muscle. That is this division of the somatic nerve or of the nervous system. All right, so you've already seen this a little bit. What we are going to do is backtrack where this all started. All right, we don't have time for that anymore. Okay, so your somatic nervous system is your voluntary nervous system. It is controlling skeletal muscle, things you have to actively think about. All right, walking, moving your arms and legs and fingers and all of that. There's also the autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is involuntary. You don't control it. Look, it still integrates at the brain, but you don't have to sit there and go, hey, heart, keep beating. Heart, beat again. Heart, beat again. All right. You're not actively voluntarily having to tell it to do that like you do. Hey, flex my arm. Hey, flex my arm. So again, what we think of as voluntary and involuntary, they still integrate at the brain, but it has to do with whether it's going down something you voluntarily control, your somatic nervous system, or something you do not control. Now, we get to now further subdivide the autonomic nervous system. And they can be divided because they have an opposing manner. All right, this should be straightforward as well. Well, I can speed up my heart, so my brain, this is involuntary, my brain can tell my heart to speed up. It can also tell it to slow down. All right, it can tell breathing to speed up. It can tell breathing to slow down, and all of those things. Digestion to speed up, digestion to slow down. So your autonomic division can be divided into an opposing manner. There's the parasympathetic division. Our parasympathetic division is often referred to as the rest and digest division. All right, think about it. I mean, look, you just had a big giant holiday meal and you ate and ate and ate. I'm pretty sure you don't feel like going outside and running a marathon. Most of us want to sit back on the couch, maybe watch a little TV, probably fall asleep on the couch. You are going to rest so that you can digest. And so when that occurs, what you are doing is you are decreasing those body systems associated, like your heart rate's going to slow down, your breathing rate will slow down, blood pressure will slow down, but you're going to ramp up getting that food digested. So as long as you sit, I mean, again, go eat a giant meal and then go out and run till you throw up. You throw up again, it ain't real appealing. All right. That's very different than your sympathetic division. Your sympathetic division is considered your flight or fight response. All right. This is what kicks in when you say, oh my gosh, the adrenaline, he could lift that car off someone. This is the system that picks up there. You are concerned with survival. All right. It's immediate, quick. You are concerned with survival. And so you ramp up those things that are going to make you have the decision to either stay and fight or run away. Again, imagine I've come to your house and I turn a lion loose inside. You're going to very quickly decide, are you going to run away or are you going to fight the lion? All right. Your fight or flight response. And so when that kicks in, it's survival mode. All right. Survival mode. I'm going to increase my heart rate. I need to pump blood. I need to deliver oxygen. All right. And doing that, my breathing rate's going to increase to deliver that oxygen. My blood pressure is going to ramp up. I'm pumping more blood. I'm going to deliver those chemicals and hormones that say, holy crap, run for your life. I promise you, I am not concerned with digestion. So we divert energy for things like that that don't matter while I'm trying to survive. And so these work in an opposing manner. If I'm speeding up my heart rate, I'm slowing down processes associated with digestion and whatnot. Now, this is kind of a glossy overview, but it's the main generalizations about the functional divisions of your nervous system and how they work. Now, I want to take a second, though, before we get to this, and draw this into sort of a functional map, because I think a picture helps with keeping track of what this is that's going on. All right, so let's start a little bit like this. All right, I introduced that you have a nervous system. And I basically said that that nervous system can be divided into two main parts. We can have your central nervous system, and we have our peripheral nervous system. Now, I'm not going to redraw everything about that. If you want to do this at home, practice that and label the things. Hey, we know this is your brain and spinal cord, nervous tissue restricted to here, and so forth. All right, what I do want to look at is then add arrows for direction of travel here. I don't remember my colors, but I'll try to sit here. Let's see. All right, now we can take the peripheral nervous system and we can divide it into our motor and our sensory responses, right? So if it's a sensory response, remember, sensory is taking information from the periphery and sending it back to the central nervous system. We then integrate that information back at the central nervous system, and my motor response is like such. So my peripheral nervous system is divided into a motor or a sensory response. Sensory information is going back towards your central nervous system, and the motor response is coming away from that. Now I'm going to keep the arrow going the same way. All right. My motor response in the periphery can be divided into two main things. I've got the somatic nervous system and I have the autonomic nervous system. So once sensory information went back, it was integrated and I knew the motor response was either part of something I didn't control or something that I do. All that occurs when it's integrated back to the central nervous system. All right, keep in mind, I'm not filling in the details. You should go back somatic, being voluntary, skeletal muscle. Now, our autonomic response can further be subdivided. And it can be divided into that, and I'm going to abbreviate here, our parasympathetic response or our sympathetic response. So I've just taken all that information I just gave you up above, and I've created a picture that helps me keep track of the direction of travel and the type of response I'm going to have. You should fill in details under that, but it's a picture of how your nervous system begins to create a map for information. Think of this like a road map. all right? Because I have a lane or a road going into that central nervous system, I know the road or lane coming out and the direction I should go, all right? The same type thing occurs as we wander through the nervous system as a whole, keeping track, or your brain being able to integrate. Up here, you can integrate information based off where it came from and where you need to send it, okay? Which now gets us to being able to look at the histology of the nervous system. When we talk about histology, that's tissue. So histology of the nervous system, histology is the study of the tissue that makes up the nervous system. Our tissue is a collection of cells, so we need to look at the cells that make up the nervous system. All right. There are two major cell categories. All right, so there's two general categories of cells. Now we're going to further subdivide this a little bit later, but what I'm just looking at is what are the main cells you find. Keep in mind, we can go back to you are made of cells. All right, we've already gone through, we looked at your skin cells. All right, we looked at fat cells, we looked at bone cells, we looked at cartilage cells. So we're just organizing the different tissues. Your tissue, nervous system tissue, has two major cell categories. Neuroglia, which are also called glial cells, that's a general word for any support cell, any supporting cell of the nervous system. All right? Any supporting cell of the nervous system. Well, the other major cell category is a neuron. When I say a neuron, to put this in perspective, you generally as a student think nerve, and a nerve is technically a collection of neurons. Think of it like when we say a neuron is a wire. Now you have a wire running into your house, chances are you have more than one wire. All right, so that bundle of wires is a nerve. Each wire makes up a neuron. The neurons are what send the impulses. They are sending the stimulus. They are sending a voltage, if you will. So the neurons are technically the wires of your body, and just like the wires in your house, electrical information travels along them. An impulse, a voltage, an electrical stimulus travels along that neuron. And there are two types of impulses. There are action potentials. You were introduced to those when we did a neuromuscular junction. But there are also, and I abbreviated up here, that's an action potential. There are also graded potentials. Now I wish we had the time to go through and all distinguish between an action potential and a graded potential. Unfortunately, I do not, but just recognize that these are types of electrical impulses that can travel along a neuron. So think of it as a type of electricity that can travel along that wire. Now, I want to come back before we introduce a neuron and talk about these supporting cells, all right? Because this is very specific as well. All right? You have neuroglia or glial cells, and neuroglia or glial cell is a general term for any supporting cell of the nervous system. However, we can divide those into the specific support cells that occur within the central nervous system versus those that occur within the peripheral nervous system. So again, neuroglia is just a supporting cell, but we have specific ones that occur and are restricted to the central nervous system. So again, when I go back, when I introduced and talked about all nerve tissue that is restricted or that lies just in the central nervous system, these cells would be some of those tissues that are restricted to there, if that makes sense. You have a different category that occur over here, okay? So a glial cell or a neuroglia is just a general term for a supporting cell, but we have specific ones depending on where we are. Now, I'm going to try to get you to see something right quick. Supporting cells, okay? Much like this wire here. Do you all see this wire? All right, now I'm going to be specific. Do you actually see the wire? Okay. The wire is what carries the electrical voltage. It is insulated by this black wrapping, so I don't get shocked. So if the neurons like the wire, then the black wrapping would be like the supporting cells. All right, so like this wire is insulated with this black wrapping, the same thing is true for the supporting cells of your nervous system. So your neurons carry these voltages, electrical voltage, but they have to have support in order to do that. One of those is an astrocyte. Astrocytes are only found in the central nervous system. They are the most abundant glial cell of the central nervous system, and their main role is several-fold. They help to support your neurons, and they help to anchor them. All right? In other words, they sort of hold and anchor your neurons in place. One of the reasons they do that is they're anchoring your neurons to a capillary supply. See, it turns out your brain and your nervous tissue need lots of oxygen. So to get that oxygen via diffusion, you want to stay close to the blood supply. All right? The neuron itself is held close to a capillary by astrocytes. So your astrocytes provide support and they anchor these neurons close to a capillary supply. All right? Another type of supporting cell is called an oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocytes produce something called myelin. That's not how you spell myelin. Myelin, sorry. All right, they produce a myelin sheath. Myelin is the same thing as an insulating layer. It is the equivalent of that black plastic around the wire, or whatever you call that. So your myelin sheath is an insulating layer that surrounds a neuron. All right, I'm gonna draw that again in a second here. Because this is, oh, I don't have to get that away. So, erase that. So in other words, if I tried to look at this here, imagine, and I'm just gonna draw this line, imagine I had an axon going down to an axon terminal. All right, your oligodendrocyte produces a myelin sheath, a wrapping that surrounds that axon. So the job of your oligodendrocyte is it produces the myelin sheath. That myelin sheath is going to insulate and protect your axon or your neuron, if you will. This black line here being the neuron. That is your neuron, or I might say nerve process. And this is the myelin. Hang on, I keep spelling that wrong. Myelin, and it is produced by an oligodendrocyte. In other words, you can think of there would be a cell right here, and it oozes out and produces this insulating layer. That's its job. All right, in addition to your oligodendrocytes, you have microglial cells. These are essentially playing a role in your immune response. They are protective, like your immune system, is that they fight off things that try to invade your brain. So these are essentially the bodyguards of your brain and nervous system, of your central nervous system. And last but not least, there are ependymal cells. Your ependymal cells are one layer of cuboidal cells, and they basically occur anywhere you have a cavity in the brain. So in lab, when you learned about the ventricles, the aqueducts, anywhere you have cerebrospinal fluid, you have a layer of these cuboidal ependymal cells. Oftentimes they are ciliated. The job of those is they help to circulate that cerebrospinal fluid. So there's just one layer of them. You have them anywhere you have an aqueduct, a ventricle, a cavity within the central nervous system, and it helps to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. All right, these 4 cells are the specific cells of your central nervous system. Now, over here in the periphery, we have specific cells. Now, I'm going to try to say this, pay attention very quickly. All right, these 2 neuroglial cells basically can do the same things as some of the cells over here. They just have a different name. So their function is going to sound very much the same. They occur in a different place. So it has the same function, but it's cells found in or restricted to the peripheral nervous system. One of those cell types are satellite cells. These satellite cells are the equivalent of astrocytes. It's just they have a different name because they occur in the periphery. So a satellite cell is the equivalent of an astrocyte, but it's restricted to the peripheral nervous system. There are also what's called Schwann cells. Your Schwann cells are the equivalent of your oligodendrocytes. They produce a myelin sheath as well. Now I'm going to draw it down here because it's slightly different. All right. Now, a question might be, wait a second, why don't we have microglial cells and ependymal cells? Well, that is because out in the rest of your body, you have your whole immune system that functions. So it's not restricted. Have you ever heard of that blood-brain barrier? Your brain's kind of isolated. So it has a lot of its own immune function built in. All right. That's not the case. Out here in the periphery, you have your own immune cells, any of your white blood cells doing that job. Your ependymal cells, well, it turns out they're circulating to CSF. You don't have cerebrospinal fluid out in the periphery. So we don't need to circulate that. You have all your other fluids out in the periphery. So these are the 2 cell types that they'll equate to an astrocyte or an oligodendrocyte. You just find them here within the peripheral nervous system. Now, a Schwann cell is slightly different. All right. It produces a myelin sheath. It absolutely produces a myelin sheath. However, it is not continuous like that's produced by the oligodendrocyte over here. Okay. So if we think about an oligodendrocyte, it actually surrounds the entire process. There are no gaps. Almost think of it like you have a hot dog in a hot dog bun. Your whole hot dog in the hot dog bun. All right. The difference for Schwann cells is they produce series of myelin. In other words, it's not continuous and there are gaps between them. These gaps between the myelin sheath or the Schwann cells are called nodes of Ranvier. And if we had more time, we'd talk about the important function of those, but just need to know some of those structures. All right, so those are the neuroglue. Those are your glial cells, and the specific ones, whether we're part of the central nervous system or peripheral nervous system. Okay, moving right along. I don't have too much more, but like I said, as I said the other day, it's a little bit of a long lecture trying to at least get the main details in. All right, as I mentioned, you have neurons, and the job of those neurons then are to send impulses. And those impulses are in the form of an action potential or a graded potential. Right? When we say a neuron, these are what we consider the wires of the body, right? Well, in order to wrap up, I want to talk about the parts of a neuron and then some of the functional classifications of neurons. And that'll then kind of give us a good place to stop, right? Now, just as a highlight here, I'm not going to write down all of these parts. I'm going to highlight them and talk about what it is that they do. So, go. Okay, what you're looking at here is a picture of a neuron. A neuron is a single cell of the nervous system, and its job is to send and respond to stimuli. So again, this is like the electrical wire. It can receive information and then send that information to another neuron. This again is part of that process of taking a sensory information impulse along one neuron, being able to integrate that with other neurons with the brain and spinal cord, to have then a motor response on another motor neuron traveling away from the brain and spinal cord. A neuron is just a single cell. And just like other cells of the body, it has a cell membrane. All right? It has a nucleus. It has the organelles that we introduced way back when we first talked about cells. But it also has some unique features. So just like a muscle, remember we introduced a sarcoplasm, a sarcolemma, myofibrils. All right, the things that make a muscle cell unique, the same thing is true of a neuron. There are things that make it unique. Now, let's start with, there is a cell body. The cell body of the neuron, of the cell, is just this expanded region. All right, it's this swollen expanded region, and that's typically where you find the nucleus. So the cell body is the enlarged expanded region where you find a nucleus. Attached to that cell body, you have dendrites. All these right here, little branches coming off this cell body, are the dendrites. They are the receivers. What we mean by that is they are the receivers of information. So in other words, there's something that's going to send information and this dendrite receives it. For all, look, this could be a temperature sensation it receives. It could be a touch sensation. It could be a pressure sensation. It could be a pain. So it receives information, and this dendrite receives it and sends that information towards the cell body. So when this dendrite receives information, the dendrite receives that information, and that information on a dendrite always travels towards the cell body. All right. You'll notice we also have somewhere, axons. They are the conducting fiber. They send information away from the cell body. In other words, this right here is your axon, and the information that travels along your axon travels away from the cell body. So if we think about this in a big picture, your dendrite's going to send some information to this cell body. The cell body essentially funnels that information to your axon, which will then send it away from here. Your axons are always sending action potentials. So when we say it sends or conducts information away from the cell body, that thing that it's conducting away or along this axon is an action potential. So here's a big picture thing. These dendrites determine whether or not you generate an action potential on this axon. Okay? An axon will carry the action potential down the axon to your axon terminals. You've seen this. If we zoomed in right here at this endpoint, this could be a neuromuscular junction. the axon turn, and we have an action potential here. What happens down here where it meets this muscle? All right. What we've done now is backtrack to what that looks like where it started. Okay. So it's carrying an action potential. Some of the other things you can see on here. All right. I've introduced already that you have Schwann cells. The Schwann cells make this myelin sheath. That's the red structures you see along this axon. Because you're seeing this, you know this is part of the peripheral nervous system because you have Schwann cells. And there are the gaps between them. That's the nodes of Ranvier. Okay? So we have all of the parts, or the main parts, that make up a neuron. And if we had more time, we could wander through more details about how this information is processed. We don't, but at least we have the parts and the general idea of what they do. In order to wrap up, what I want to do lastly is sort of classify our neurons, because we've done this with nearly every system we've introduced, whether it's the joints or the bones, any of that kind of stuff. Obviously, the classification of neurons can be described based on their structure or their function. So if we look at structural class, then here's what we got. Structural classification of a neuron. The structure of it is based on the number of processes extending from the cell body. Let's go back to this picture. So we can classify a neuron based off how many of these processes are coming off of it. The dendrites, those are one type of process, and a dendrite always carries information towards the cell body. An axon, that's another type of process. It always carries information away from the cell body. So now we've got these processes. A dendrite or an axon is just a process. It means an extension coming off the cell body. Think of it like the trunk of your tree. The trunk of your tree is the cell body, and you have the branches and all of the roots. All of those represent a process. Okay, there's different types. You all, I think, if you see a tree, you know that the roots are not the same thing as the branches with the leaves. And that's what we're trying to equate here. All right. So if we classify them, we can classify them, based on the number of processes extending from the cell body. So I've added a picture so that you can see the three types. There are three structural types of neurons. There are unipolar neurons. That means there's only one extension coming off the cell body. There is only one point that comes off the cell body. Notice that is myelinated, so this is your axon. Now that axon may branch, but there's only one point where we leave the cell body. You know this is the cell body because it is expanded, and we see the nucleus in here. Unipolar, one point, and that point that comes off is an axon. If you have a bipolar neuron, bipolar means two. So now we have two things coming off the cell body. This is your cell body with your axon, and you have two extensions, one here and one here. Now, here's what's really awesome about that. We know this is the dendrite, and we know this is the axon. Well, Dr. Grillo, how do you know that? Well, if we go back to this picture, dendrites are never myelinated. Axons are always myelinated. So your axons are going to have a myelin sheath. The dendrites never have a myelin sheath. So you can always recognize a dendrite, and you can always recognize an axon. Myelination, we got an axon. Dendrite, no myelination. So if we are also looking at that to compare, then this dendrite is carrying information towards that cell body, and the axon would be carrying it away. Okay? So now, last but not least, I have a multipolar neuron. Obviously, that means many extensions coming off of the cell body. So again, we have our cell body, we have our nucleus. To be a multipolar neuron, we have to have multiple extensions coming off the cell body. Technically, it would be 3 or more. All right, 3 or more. So I can draw another one over here just to try to illustrate what I mean. 1, 2, 3. That can't be bipolar because there are 3. Now, we can always distinguish between the axon and the dendrite. For any neuron, there is only ever one axon. Now, that axon can branch, but you will only ever have one axon. So here is my axon. Here is my axon. You can have multiple dendrites. All of these that attach here are dendrites. Dendrites carry information that way. The axon is carrying it away. You will only ever have one axon, one axon, one axon, one axon. You can have more than one dendrite. This is the structural. So how many processes are coming off that neuron? Mr. Lane, do you have a question? Okay, I thought there was a question there. I'm looking at something different, sorry. Okay, back to my thing here. So then last but not least, to wrap up, functional classification. Now, the function, and you've already had most of the function now, pretty straightforward because we outlined it. I added a little bit of fun, talking about the direction up here. The function has to do with the direction that the impulse is traveling on this neuron. Axons always carry information away from, dendrites always carry information to, but we classify that based off a couple of things. All right. Functionally, and you've already had this, there are sensory or afferent neurons. And again, this should already sound familiar. Sensory or afferent information always travels towards your central nervous system. So functionally, we can say we're sensory. Your motor or efferent always travels away from the central nervous system. And there's one other category we haven't seen functionally, and that is an interneuron. An interneuron is a relay neuron that occurs between the brain and spinal cord. In other words, it is restricted to the central nervous system. So let me try, a glossy overview of what that would look like. Okay, so real quick here, brain, spinal cord. I'm wrapping up here, brain and spinal cord, whoops. Sorry, brain. I don't know what I did there. All right, remember this. Hello. All somehow. I don't know what's going on. I figure out what I did. Hold on just a sec. I don't know what. All right, this is your central nervous system. This out here is your peripheral nervous system. And so here's what I'm trying to get you to see. Functionally, sensory information travels this direction. We could add a structure to it. Again, I don't have time, but sensory information travels along a neuron back to the brain and spinal cord. when it gets back to that brain and spinal cord, it's going to get on interneurons as it relays up to the brain and back down, in order for you to then have your motor response. That is the functional categories. Interneurons are restricted to the central nervous system. Notice a sensory and a motor neuron is not. All right? Unfortunately, we don't have the time we need to wander through the rest of the nervous system. That'll be a good place to stop, at least a good foundation. Again, got this information up through here for your final exam. All right, I've enjoyed the class. I wish we were in the classroom, but hopefully this worked out okay. As a side note, Curtis critiques are available. You should use that opportunity to say what's good and bad about the course, whether, again, it can be whatever you want it to be, but take the time to do that and stuff. If you have questions between now and next week, just reach out. I'm happy to help, try to provide some guidance, things like that. So with that being said, that is